Merhaba. No. Today we have many things. We have lunch in the middle. If we're running late, we may cut a few, maybe this or this. I don't know.
Yeah,
this.
Skippable,
yes. Okay. So let's talk about what Microsoft is doing with web frameworks. We have Visual Studio. We just had a new release come out a few days, update 2. Does anyone have this? Update 2 for? So there's a new update. Good. Very well, sir. Very good. We have NuGet. NuGet is a way for installing things that you can use inside of Visual Studio or .NET applications. And most project, when you say file new project, a lot of NuGet packages are installed. So NuGet is important to understand as a developer. So we'll talk about that. ASP.NET, of course. And we'll look a little bit at Windows Azure for hosting. So who here is using Windows Azure websites? Is anyone? Good. It's free hosting, so why not? I use it a lot. I try something, maybe a Node site, ASP site, try something, throw it up, delete it. It's free. So Visual Studio 2012 came out last August, and I really like it as a web editor. So before, I used Visual Studio for C# and ASP.NET. But if I needed to do HTML, I would use something else sometimes, like Notepad, Notepad++, or Notepad 2 or something. But now they've added so many things into Visual Studio 2012 for CSS, HTML5, really good JavaScript support. So I'll show you some of those things. Now, most of the time, I'm using Visual Studio for my web editing. So I'll show you why I think that's a good idea. Also, Web Essentials extension. Who here is using Web Essentials? Good, good. It's great. I wish more people knew about it. It's very helpful. So we'll look at that. So the idea with NuGet is, in the past, you can't write all your code yourself. There's too many things, logging and all things that if you wrote all the code, it would take you forever. So the idea in the past, you would go and you would search and you would say someone has written a logging framework, or someone has written an Hibernate extensions, or one of these things. You would download it, you would have an assembly, you would unzip it, and then you would try and put it in, you would add the assembly reference, and then you would find out it has other dependencies that you need to install, and then you need to read the documentation to configure it, and you spend all day doing that, and then you give up. And so with the idea with NuGet is to make it very easy to use assemblies or other things people have built. One example is jQuery. People don't think of jQuery as something that would be in NuGet. But when you do file new project on a ASP.NET Web Forms or MVC application, it will install jQuery NuGet package. And the reason is then we can track dependencies and we can help with updates. So for example, if you have jQuery validation, and jQuery validation requires jQuery, then later, if you want to upgrade jQuery validation and it needs a new version of jQuery, it will upgrade them both. So this is a good way to keep things in sync. It handles all the setup and all the keeping track of things. So I'm mentioning it now because it's part of how we do development now with anything in .NET, so it's good to know about. In the past, we would do a WebCamp, and at the end, halfway through the day, people would say, excuse me, what is NuGet? And so I want to tell you early to make sure everyone knows. Who here has seen Scott Hanselman say oneasp.net? Do you know Scott Hanselman, some people? So the idea is that we have one ASP.NET core. And then you have things like web forms, you have MVC, web API, all these things that run on top of ASP.NET. So when I first started to learn MVC, I'd been doing web forms development for a long time. And when I first started to learn MVC, I was worried that I would have to learn new things about security or authentication or caching and handlers and modules, all these things I had learned in web forms. Well, those all still work because MVC also uses ASP.NET. Am I speaking too fast? Is this a good speed? Too fast? Okay. Okay, thank you. You have to show me you're awake. I'm kind of awake. I've been traveling for 1 week in Europe and in Denmark and then here. And so I'm finally almost adjusted to the time, just in time to fly home tomorrow morning, where my clock will again be all wrong. So, ASP.NET and Web Tools 2012.2. I need to update this slide because it is no longer RC. So this has new changes for ASP.NET for web forms, for MVC, SignalR, Web API. It does not change ASP.NET. It's only new additional changes for project templates. So this means it is safe. This means you don't need to change your server in order to upload this. It means that if I build a project using ASP.NET Web Tools 2012.2, and I zip the file and I put it on my flash drive, and I give it to you, and you open it on your computer, it will work. So it's the same ASP.NET. So what's changed is we've changed the project templates. So the project templates now add new things. As an example, when you do a Web API project, it will now add in help pages and tracing, makes it easier to use. But it doesn't break your old projects. So safe. It takes about 5 minutes to install, and you can always find everything that's new with ASP.NET vNext. So this is where we always keep all the information. It's also included in this release, which came out 2 days ago. So this new ASP.NET, or Visual Studio 2012 Update 2 includes that ASP.NET and Web Tools 2012.2. Does this make sense? Any questions on that? Good. I recommend using this instead of waiting a long time. It adds new features, and it's working faster, and it fixes things for me. So I'm happy, especially with this. This update adds a lot of great new things. OK. I mentioned Windows Azure. You've heard about Windows Azure a lot, probably. I had heard about Windows Azure a lot. I didn't like it at first. I'm an ASP.NET developer. I've been doing ASP.NET development since 2002 or 2000, when it first came out. Before that, I'd been doing classic ASP, maybe some PHP, different Visual Basic 6. So I've been a developer for a long time. I've been a Microsoft employee for 3 years. So I'm telling you honestly, at first when I saw Azure, too complicated. I like what I'm seeing now with Windows Azure. Scott Guthrie has taken over for a lot of things on Windows Azure, and the developer experience is so much better. So if you are like me and you looked at Windows Azure and you said no, I would recommend to look at it again. Because, for instance, Windows Azure websites is very easy. You can do many things for free, and you can FTP, you can use PHP, Node.js, classic ASP, ASP.NET, of course, and it's all very easy to use. When you start paying is when you want your own domain name. So if you want www.com, then you start paying money. But if you want azurewebsites.net, that's free. So we use that for the WebCamp site, devcamps.ms. We have free accounts set up for QA and staging. So we make a change, git push, test it out, everything works. We send an email to a project manager or a marketing person, and they say, looks good, and then we push it to production. So this is something that's free, and I recommend starting to use it. If you have an MSDN account, you get even more. In addition to free, you get storage and other things. You get compute hours, things like that. Oops. What I'm going to show you, this is a pretend demo because I'm just going to do some screenshots. So what I wanted to show is what it's like to sign up for Windows Azure if you haven't already. The most important thing that I checked before I signed up is the spending limit. So the reason I do that is because part of signing up is you have to put in a credit card. And I worried that they would take money out of my credit card. And when you first sign up, there is a $0, $0, €0. There's a zero spending limit, right? They will not take money out until you check the box that says you can take some money. So this spells out the information about it, and it says, we will not take your money until you say OK. So you go to windowsazure.com, you click on Try It Free. It tells you what you get. You have to authenticate with a text message. They tell me this and also credit cards they did because before, if it would be too easy for people to sign up, someone bad to write a program to sign up 10,000 free accounts and use them to attack another site and things like that back and forth. So this is to verify who you are. So after putting in a credit card, then this, then it tells you that you're welcome. And then here is the portal. So there are a lot of different things on here. This is websites, which has the 10 free sites. And then there are a lot of other things in here, SQL databases, things like that. If you have MSDN, then you get free hours or credits towards those. So this is my little sales pitch. I'm on the Windows Azure evangelism team. But I like to sell things that are free. And so I think that this is a good place to start. So I joined the Azure evangelism team because I finally liked what they had. So we talked about these building blocks. And now you can see my PowerPoint animation. And these are some of the things we'll talk about today that we add on top of this core. I spent a long time on this animation. I hope you liked it. So we'll look at HTML5, what you can do with the new project templates, with Visual Studio. We'll look at Web API. If we have time, I'll show you a trick with that you can build HTML5, Web API. You can build taskbars and things for Office 2013. And then we'll look at some other things, mobile, real-time with SignalR, some things. So these are the building blocks, and here are some things we can do. Does that make sense? So this morning, we'll talk about building blocks more, especially really these three. You saw my presentation on this, really. Later in the afternoon, Umit has a presentation on that. And then more towards early afternoon, we'll be looking at some of those. This is the end of the keynote, kind of short keynote. So here are some places where you can find out more. I help with the ASP.NET site. I help to keep it up to date. If you don't like something about it, then tell me, and I will help get it fixed. One thing I want to show you on this, if some of it is hard to read or would be easier to read in Turkish, we've worked to put on a translate widget. And it's not perfect, but it can help sometimes, people tell me. So if we go to an example, say we'll look at so we have over in the sidebar here, scrolling everywhere. Stop. So here we have a translation widget, and this does include Turkish. I don't know if it's good. Maybe you can tell me if it's correct. It's machines translating it, but they tell me it works pretty well. So that's it for the keynote. We're going to go into what's new in ASP.NET and Visual Studio. Do we have any questions so far? Any thoughts? Should I go talk slower? Good? OK. This is the part we should have some music playing while I change. Do 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 do. I'm speaker. Okay, here are some things we'll be looking at for what's new in ASP.NET 4.5 and Visual Studio 2012. So in this part, we have a separate session for MVC, for Web API, for SignalR. So we're not talking about those here. One of the things I am going to show off is some new features for web forms. How many people here are using web forms, doing mostly web forms development? That's great. Be proud. We're doing good things for web forms. I've been using, I've done a lot of websites in web forms. I've been using it for a long time. I'm very jealous now of some of these new features. I wish I had them a long time ago. So we'll look at model binding, at friendly URLs, strongly typed data controls. And then these things work for everything. So this is in Visual Studio. This is a Visual Studio feature. And we'll look at bundling and optimization, which works for everything in ASP.NET. And finally, async if we have time. So I mentioned this before. We have one ASP.NET framework. So we have, everything is running on top of ASP.NET. Let's jump in. So first, we're going to look at strongly typed data controls. And the idea with strongly typed data controls is it fixes one of my most common errors. When you're using a data binding inside of any kind of data control in web forms, you have to put in where you bind to. So eval or bind or any of these things. So you say, this grid item or list view item or whatever, it comes from this element in the data. The problem is that that's a string, right? So if you type it wrong, if you misspell it, you would not know until you run the page or until your user hits the page before you see it, right? So this is a little small, and I'll show you in code. I think it's better to see in Visual Studio anyways. But the idea is we say what type we're going to be binding to, and then inside the control, we don't need any quotes. There's no quotes here. So we just say bind to item.firstname or item.lastname. So that means two good things at least. One is, when I'm developing, when I view this page, if I spell this wrong, I get a red squiggly, I get an error. Also, this is a string. So if I hit dot after this, I get string IntelliSense. So this is now, it's not just a string that's evaluated at runtime. This is actually something that I can see as I'm developing. We like that? Did anyone know about that before? Nobody knows about this. It's been out since August of last year. If I was doing web forms development, if I was working on a web forms project, I would use this on everything. It was very nice. The next thing we'll look at is how we get data in and out of data controls in web forms. So we have a new feature here, which is select method, update method. So instead, in the past, you would have a control. And in page load, you would say list view.data source equals, and you would get your data from somewhere there. And then inside the control, you have to bind your property, bind where things go to and all this. We've changed that now. That all still works, but we have a better option for you now. And the better option is, here I have a repeater, and I have a select method, which is get customers. And then I don't have to do this control equals this, blah, blah, blah. That's gone. Then inside my page, my page code behind, I have a method here, and I say get customers, and it returns an iQueryable. And nowhere in here do I say my list view.datasource.item, none of that, okay? So here we're showing one thing where we're binding to something, but that's not required. If we didn't do that, and I sent you this code, you wouldn't know if it was in web forms or MVC or a console application or a service, right? So now your code is portable, it's testable, it's reusable. You could reuse this between services or in a web forms and MVC application. And it's also cleaner code. It's simpler and it's not tightly coupled. between your web form and your page code. Does that make sense? Good? I love this feature. If you're doing web forms development, I recommend really looking into this. Finally, we looked at how to get data out or data into a control. Then let's say you have a form and you hit post, you need to get that data back into your database or something, right? So the same as we had a get method, now we also have an insert method. And inside my page markup, I say insert customer. And then now in my page code, I have insert customer method. Nowhere in here does this say form view dot or whatever, or text box first name dot text. That's all gone. Instead, we're using the same type of binding as you would see in what? This looks a lot like what type of, does this look familiar to anybody? No? Somebody say it loud and I'll give you a USB key. It looks like MVC. Yes, you're all too slow. Next time. Okay, this is the same pattern as we use in MVC. So we have try update model. And what this does is, it says, I have a customer object. So it looks in the form, and it says, my customer has a first name. And the form has a customer first name property. And so it does model binding. So it populates all those properties automatically for you. And then we can check if it's valid. And we check using data annotations for you. So this is very simple, testable code, and it's also completely reusable. So if you're doing web forms and MVC development, you can share your code, and you can share what you know. I talk to people who are doing a lot of web forms development and are interested in learning more about MVC. And I recommend this as a good way to do that. Because if you're good with this style of development, it gets a lot easier to do MVC development. We have the same models. We have similar, this is kind of like the controller. And the only thing that's different is instead of a view in MVC, we have a control. So we're outputting or binding to a control instead of a view. But it's very similar. Question? Yeah, okay. I want to give you a key here for actually asking a question. Okay, you're binding to what?
You are explicitly binding the model here.
Yes.
You are defining this customer.
Yes.
And then you are binding the model in the line.
Yes.
Is there a way, like in the MVC, that you can just pass as a parameter in the method? Do we have now this model binding directly?
I don't think so. I don't think so, but I'm not sure actually. So I'll check on that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think the idea is that you say insert customer.
No, I'm just assuming if we can have a parameter like customer in this method signature. Insert customer, it's a customer parameter here.
Right.
It's directly binded, like
yeah.
we use in MVC.
No, and I think the reason is because this control talks directly to this, so there's no kind of in-between place where you would map that up. Okay. So one more thing here, and then we'll start looking at some real code for it. The idea here is instead of having your URL look like this, or sometimes worse, right? It's /album/edit ASP or edit ASPX $ID equals blah 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 blah, right? So instead, we want nice-looking URLs. And friendly URLs has been around for a while, and it's been available as a NuGet package, and now it's included in File New Project web forms. So if you have Visual Studio 2012 installed, you can just do this. It's already working for you. You may just not have known about it. Okay? What's also nice is here we have a control that we're binding to. And we have this ID 1, so ID 1. We need to get that into the page and then into the control. And what's nice is that this is also easy to map for us. So it can pass the information into those methods I showed before, the select, insert, update methods. It will automatically pass those IDs in. So it makes it very easy to have nice looking URLs, but also to get those URLs into the controls. I think we need a demo, right? Okay. Has anyone used the MVC Music Store tutorial? Okay, good. Yep, a lot of people. So I decided to use the same models that are in the MVC Music Store and bring them into a web forms application. So here you can see this is a model in MVC. So if I zoom it way out, this is just a class. This is a C# class. There's no inherits from anything. There's no other methods to it, right? These are simple properties, and we have some data annotations like required or string length. So those say, those tell web forms or MVC that this field is required or that we need this specific data type, and it can do validation for us. So when I said before of try update model, this is how it will validate to make sure that the model is correct. All right? So I'm going to run this, and then we'll look at the page code to see how it's actually working. Checking the time here. Okay. They tell me that this circle here is called the blue circle of patience. So it's like the yellow screen of death or the blue screen of death. This is the blue circle of patience. Right now, this is actually, it's creating the database for me. This application is using Entity Framework code first. So it's looking at my model class. It's looking at this class, and it's saying, I have a class album. It has an album ID. And then it says this is the same as this, and it ends with ID. So this is the primary key, right? And then it's figuring out that these are IDs in other tables. And it's creating here a title, which is a string. So it's creating that database for me automatically, which is maybe why it's taking so long. Come on, faster. OK, well, it's doing that. I'm going to also go into some of the other code, so we're not waiting. So first, we're going to look at, we want to look at a list of albums. So I have a default page. The first thing that I want to show with this is that it's using an item type. So this is my item type. This is the one time in the control where I need to say, this is the type of class that I'm going to bind to, or that I'm going to display. So we have our only quotes that we need to put in are right here and right here. And then down later in the page, when we are binding to it, we have item.albumID. There's no quotes here, right? So we're binding directly to that. And if I hit this dot, these are all properties of an artist. So I can see I get my IntelliSense there. So now we'll go in, and I think that was album ID. And now if I hit that dot, this is all IntelliSense for an integer. So for instance, toString, right? If instead I did .title, then this is IntelliSense for a string. Does that make sense? So this does two things for me. One, it lets me know that I'm binding to the right thing. And two is, it's easier for me to write other code because it's strongly typed. OK, so now let's see if it's finally ready. There it is. OK. So here we have a list of albums. I'm going to click on one. Let's go back to that real quick. So here we have that list, right? So I showed you this is how we're binding to it. We set our item type, and we're binding to it. We also need to get that data. So we have a select method. The select method needs to return either IEnumerable or iQueryable. So we'll look at that real quick. Okay. So notice there is no code in the page load. There's nowhere where we're saying this dot this equals that dot that. There's none of that. This is my entire method that's populating that repeater. Okay? So I am using Entity Framework code first. You could use nhibernate. You could use MySQL, SQL Server, anything you'd like. All you need to do is return an iQueryable or an IEnumerable. And then because this is returning a list or an iQueryable, then I can call .take because I only want the first 10. Does that make sense? Yes, question. Is it stateless? Yes, yes, it is. It is. So it's not using, yes, right. You're not, well, you kind of are. I mean, when you go through, you do need to think of it as it's the same controls. So if the control was using view state, it will still use that view state. So it's really just using this as your data source to populate that repeater. Okay? So the idea is we don't want to break all the old web forms code. So the controls work the same. This is just a new way to get data in and out of those controls. Okay? So now I'm going to click on one of these. And I just want to show you a little bit more of this. So here I have a details view. This is actually my an edit page. And so here when I click on edit, this shows the item, and it also shows some drop-downs. And this shows all my artists and all my genres. So we'll look at how we use those same things with the binding expressions and with the select methods to populate those. So I'm going to go into my edit. So here I have album edit. So again, I have an item type here. So I say that this is an album. And then I have a few things. I have a select method to display the data and an edit method to update it. Okay, so here is my select method. Again, this is just getting the data. And then my update method, this is the new one, and this is what looks like MVC here. So this is I'm finding the item, and then I'm saying if it's null, then it wasn't found and we're returning an error. Otherwise, we call try update model. So try update model looks at at what's in the form view, and it looks at my data annotations, and it says, is it okay? So what that means is, if I go in here and I type some text, oops. It's a different one. I'm sorry. I'm doing something wrong here. I should have gotten IntelliSense or a validation error. I broke it somehow. But this will then, it'll call try update model, and then it will say if it's not valid, or if it is valid, it will save changes. Okay? One last thing I want to show you on this edit page is that we want to populate the drop-downs. So our list of albums and genres. So that's these ones right here. This list. Okay? So if we look in here at those drop-downs, I have a drop-down list. And my select method is get genres. That's all the code that I need. So now let's look at all the 5 million lines of code for get genres. Actually, it's just one, right? Because it's that same pattern. We just need to get our data. So this is about all we're going to talk about with web forms today. but there are a significant amount of people using web forms, and I think this is the most important thing I would tell you about web forms, is to be aware of these new features, okay? The one thing actually also is that friendly URLs, but I really didn't have to do anything. It just automatically worked. So here's my nice looking URL there. And when I need to bind to it, when I'm binding in the edit expression, I just do that. So I just said, it's looking for an integer ID, and it automatically found it. I didn't have to do any work to hook that up. The reason is friendly URLs will say, well, this is an update method. We already know what the control is, and we already know that there's an ID there, so we'll just pass it in. Okay? Now, we're going to move on to the next thing, but I'm going to show you this using the same project. So this is Page Inspector. I want to show you this really quickly because I think this is a very useful feature in Visual Studio that not a lot of people know about. So we just looked at running the page, and it's very common to look at something in a browser, and then you go in Visual Studio and change something, and then you go back to the browser, and then back to Visual Studio, and back and forth and back and forth. So we have actually built in Page Inspector, which is using the IE10 engine. And it does a lot of magic. I don't know how they do it, but there's magic involved. Oops, I clicked the wrong thing. That's not the one. I'm right-clicking on this, and I'm going to View in Page Inspector. So what this is doing is, inside of Visual Studio, it's starting up a special version of IE10. And what's important to know is this isn't just a design window that's going to show some pretend data or what this could look like. This is actually coming out of the database. So these are those same albums that were coming out of the database. What's helpful here is that I can click on things. So if I click on Inspect, now I can see where this information is coming from. So for instance, this is coming from an item template. This works also in MVC. And in MVC, it will show you what view it came from, or what partial view. So that solves the problem of how do I, looking around and trying to say what code made which HTML. So here I can say, for instance, this login button, where is that coming from? And notice when I'm mousing around in here, that this code is updating. So that means if I want to change the login button, that actually took me over to site master. Okay? So, and I can change things. If I change in one, it will update in the other. It now has support for live CSS updates. So let me see if I can do that real quick. So here, if I go into, that's not what I wanted. Site CSS. OK, so if I go in and start changing things, for instance, body back color. Right? So as I'm changing the CSS, it's changing what we see on the other side. We can also see we've got a color picker. So here I can go in and pick, and these are colors that are in my CSS already. So this makes it very quick, and this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that Visual Studio is now a really helpful HTML editor, because it can do things for you that Notepad or other things can't do. So it's automatically looking at the page, and I can go in and I can trace the styles, and I can see why is something in one area a specific color. So I can say, who made this pink? Why is it like that? Right? I can click on that, and I can go in and find that area, and then I can drill down in, and I can look at that color or background color, and I can find out which thing is setting that. All right? So now we'll take a look. That was Page Inspector, and that's built into Visual Studio. And you can use that in web forms or MVC. or, well, yeah, web forms are MVC. And, and it's very helpful for finding out, code and HTML and CSS and how they work together. All right. Now we'll talk about bundling and optimization. So when you browse to a page, to a web page, you first get some HTML. And that's the beginning of a lot of other requests. And we only think about this one. We think about we're generating HTML, and we don't remember that our pages have a lot of CSS references, images, JavaScript libraries, and those take a lot of time. And the user can't use the page until they have all of this, okay? So the MSN team at Microsoft had a solution to this problem. They built something internally just for them, and they called it WebGrease. And it was a system that took a lot of these things and made them faster, made this happen faster. And so the ASP.NET team and the MSN team talked together, and they said, can we take part of what you're using and ship it with ASP.NET? And they figured out how to do that. Some of the things are not in there because they only made sense for MSN. But a lot of it, we were able to say, well, everybody has this problem, and we'll make this work for everyone. So this is built in to Web Forms 4.5 and MVC 4. So the steps of this, we have bundling and minification. So bundling is where we take all of these and we say 1, 2, 3, 4 JavaScript files. We can put 1, 2, 3, 4 in one request. So your files don't change, but when ASP.NET sends the page code to the user, it concatenates that. It puts them all together. So now we have one CSS file and one JavaScript file. So it just does that by adding them together. So that's bundling. The next thing is called minification. And this is a very, very subtle thing here. Watch this. This is how big this JavaScript file was before. When minification is done, it shrinks it down. Okay? So these are screenshots. I forget which page I went to. But the idea is when you're developing JavaScript, you want to be able to read it because you have to make changes and debug it and things like that. The same with your CSS. You may have text, font size, font family, a lot of settings. But you can shrink those down. In JavaScript, you don't need a long variable name for the browser. It can be one letter, right? So the WebGrease engine in bundling and minification goes through, and it actually has a parser, and it does some very smart things that I don't understand to shrink everything way down, okay? So that's bundling and minification, and that is built into Web Forms and MVC, but you can use them to do additional things. So we'll take a quick look at that. That's a very peppy song. So I know it's morning, and I hear a lot of people wiggling in their seats, and we'll take a coffee break soon, okay? I'll keep you awake. This is the last thing we're going to look at in this session. So bundling and minification has a lot of features built in. First, we'll look at something. Let me go back, actually, to that friendly URLs. And I'll show you what was built in for the CSS and HTML without us doing any work. So there are a lot of JavaScript libraries, things like jQuery. There's CSS files. And so if you go into the app start folder, so this is where we're putting all of our, instead of having some things in global ASAX or scattered around, app start is now the new location for all of our configuration. So if we look at bundle config, you'll see that we have, because this is a Web Forms app, we have some standard Web Forms JavaScript. So we take all of these JavaScript files and we put them together into one reference, which is webforms.js. Okay? And we do the same thing with some others, like for instance, this is MS Ajax, we have Modernizer. Okay? So we go through and we put all those together. And now inside, this is web forms, but I'll show you in an MVC app in a second. So if we look at our site master, we just do scripts.render and we put in the bundle name. Okay? And so what that does, we can also do script reference. So there we're referencing, you know, just a jQuery bundle. And that jQuery bundle is going to pull in all of our jQuery. So that's automatically building everything for us. Now let's look over at a more advanced one. This is with an MVC app, but we've made some changes. So I'm going to run this. And I'm actually going to bring it up in Chrome. And the reason I'm using Chrome is because, i.e., when you view a page, if you reference some JavaScript, it will want you to download the file. But I want to view the text of that file. So neither is really right or wrong, but Chrome is easier to demonstrate this with. Okay? So here we have some custom bundles. And I want to show you a very simple one first. We've got a static JavaScript bundle. So this one, as I mouse over it, it goes to static bundle. So I'm going to take a look at how that bundle is configured. So again, I'm in app start, and then it's bundle config. So if I look at static bundle, here's some code. I say, we're creating a new script bundle. This is the pretend name for it. There's no folder named static bundle. Okay? So when I browse to this, or when my page references that, it's going to include all of these scripts. Okay? So now, if we look at some of those scripts, they're going to have things like comments and other things in them. So here's one script. We have a lot of lines of code, but you know, not really much actually happening. So we also, here's another one with this, right? Now if I click on this, it took all those functions and it compressed them like crazy. So for one thing, it took out all of my comments. It shortens up things as much as possible. So for instance, here, this was a lot longer in the other, in the original one, right? So this is the reason I'm showing you this is so, you know, it's already doing some things for you, but you can do quite a bit more if you would like. You can define your own bundles. So let's look at a couple more neat ones. One is, here's a CSS bundle. Okay, so this one just says CSS bundle and it looks like that. Now if we look at how that's actually working, so I'm going to go back to my bundle config and let's look at CSS bundle. Okay, where is CSS bundle? Okay, I think that's it. Yes, okay. So this is just pulling in one. So that's not very, very difficult. But what I want to show you is, let's compare site.css so there's a lot in here. There's comments, there's a lot of duplicated things, right? But when we look at this, it shortened that all down. And we can look at a more complicated case. There's another one in here called, let me see, supermassive CSS bundle. Okay? So this one pulls in a lot of different ones. So if we look at base bundle CSS, that's this one. This is pulling in a ton of different things, a lot of jQuery CSS, jQuery UI CSS, right? So we're referencing a lot of things. There's a huge amount there, but when we do this, this is streamlining it as much as possible. There's one last thing I want to show you here, which is that you can extend the bundling to use other minifiers. What that means is that we can take advantage of some new languages like CoffeeScript. So CoffeeScript is one of many languages which helps you write JavaScript easier. So the way it does that is it gives you a lot simpler syntax. So here I have this code on the left is CoffeeScript, and this is the actual JavaScript that it compiled to. Right? So if I want to make this incorrect, and I say, right? So when I saved it, it actually changed that. So one is compiling to the other. So this is nice for developing. But, and so I can go through and I can write my code with CoffeeScript. But then when I want to actually send it to the user, we can use a custom CoffeeScript minifier, which will do that compilation for us. So here this is done using just this line. So we say, add a new reference, any file that ends with .coffee, use the coffee minify. And coffee minify is very, very simple. We've used a NuGet package to pull in a CoffeeScript compiler. And so all this does is it extends a JS minify class, which is built in with bundling. And then it uses this compiler and sends it out. So it just says response.content equals, and it sends the result of that compiler. So we have one other one in here, which is a less syntax. Is anyone using less at all? So good. Back in the back there. So less is an example that makes it easier to write CSS. So JavaScript or TypeScript, or excuse me, like CoffeeScript and TypeScript and some other languages make it easier to write JavaScript. CSS can be frustrating to write because you don't have support for things like variables. So you can't one time in the page say, this is my brand color, and then use that more than one time. I don't know if I set off an alarm somehow. Okay, so here, this is the second WebCamp I've had this happen in. It's my fault somehow. Okay, so here we set a variable and we want to use it more than one time. Here's my less syntax where I just define that variable and I can do more with it. I can also, in less, I can use something called mix-ins, which are like a function. So here I'm using some mix-ins, and I'm able to create rounded corners and then reuse it. So I can say rounded corners 10 pixels and reuse it on this side. Okay? Now, in order to change, browsers don't know how to work with less. They only know CSS. And so we've defined a less minifier, and it looks pretty similar to what we looked at before. So here's less minify. Okay? So we have .less, which was a NuGet package. So I've talked, Tuberk, you were saying that you started using, which one was it, less?
Yeah.
And your team was pretty happy to see that, right?
Yeah. We started using less, but we are using a different kind of approach. We are just compiling down to less, compiling down to CSS from less. Then we save the changes to less files through the web essential support.
Right.
So, and we are once again defining the CSS files.
So what Tuberk's pointing out is you have two options. With built in with the Web Essentials extension, whenever I save this less file, it's actually automatically also saving the file and a minified version of it. Or it could, sorry. Let me look at my CSS. Yeah, so here I can go into Web Essentials, and if I wasn't running, I could say create CSS bundle. Okay? And so that would save it for me as I'm working. Or I can do it at runtime, or at runtime using bundling and minification. So here's that CSS, or that's the coffee script that I showed you, converted to JavaScript, bundled and minified. And this is the less, and this is bundled and minified. So part of the reason I'm showing you these things is you already have them. If you're using Visual Studio, especially if you use the Web Essentials extension, and if you're using ASP.NET 4.5 or MVC4, you already have bundling and minification built in. So you can go in with a tool like Fiddler, or in any browser, if you hit F12 to bring up your developer tools, then you can see what's going on, and you see all your script files, but it's only one request for your script. And I think that's all the slides we have, and judging from, I hear a little murmuring, so maybe that's all the patience we have too. Would anyone like to ask a question in Turkish? Stubert could take the question. No? Questions in English? Any questions? Yes?
Is there a way to use this bundling and minification without MVC tool?
I don't know. I don't know about that. It's pulled in as a NuGet package. I believe I don't think so, because I believe it's going to require .NET 4, and MVC2 won't work with that. But if you go up to MVC3, then I think it might all work together. So, okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's see where we're at on the schedule. I think next is MVC. Let's take a short break. So right now the time is 10:30. So let's take a break until 10:40. You can get coffee and jump around and everything. We'll start back at 10:40 and we'll do MVC.